He built an empire on his voice. Then his own body took it away. For years, Jordan Peterson was one of the most listened to men alive. Arenas on 5 continents. A YouTube channel followed by millions. A book that turned a university lecture into a global movement. Then, quietly, he went silent. Not because he ran out of things to say. Because his body stopped letting him say them. This is the story of how that happened. And why the man who taught the world to carry suffering ended up carrying more of it than almost anyone expected. Jordan Peterson didn't start out famous. He was a clinical psychologist trained at McGill, who taught at Harvard before coming home to Canada. For most of his career, he was respected in academic circles and unknown everywhere else. That changed in 2016, when he refused to comply with a piece of Canadian legislation around compelled speech. A video meant for a small audience of students spread far beyond his classroom. Almost overnight, a professor became a public figure. 2 years later came the book. Millions of copies sold. A sold-out world tour. A man once known to a lecture hall was now known to the world, but somewhere behind that success, something else was already starting. In 2019, his wife Tammy was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive cancer. The prognosis wasn't good, and there was nothing in any lecture Peterson had ever given that made that fear smaller. To manage the anxiety of that period, he'd been taking a low-dose anti-anxiety medication for years. As his wife's diagnosis deepened the pressure at home, that dose increased. And somewhere in that increase, a manageable prescription turned into something far more serious, a dependency neither he nor his doctors fully saw coming. When he tried to come off it, his body didn't just resist, it rebelled. The condition is called akathisia, a relentless, full-body restlessness. People who experience it describe being unable to sit still, unable to lie down, unable to find one single position anywhere that brings relief. Not for minutes, for hours. Day after day. For a man whose entire identity was built on discipline and self-control, it was a uniquely specific kind of unraveling. The one thing akathisia takes from you is stillness, the most basic form of self-mastery there is. His wife's cancer, against the odds, went into remission. But while she healed, he didn't. The family sought treatment overseas. At one point, doctors placed him in a medically induced coma just to give his nervous system a chance to reset. It was his daughter, Michaela, who first stepped in front of a camera to explain to the public what the family was going through, a role she would end up returning to more than once. Then 2020 added its own weight. COVID twice. Pneumonia. By the time Peterson gave a real public interview again, longtime followers barely recognized him. Thinner, slower, a long way from the man who used to fill arenas. He recovered publicly, at least. But bodies keep records that lectures can't erase. And years later, that record would come due again, in a form nobody in his family was ready for. By mid-2025, the signs were back. Fewer appearances. A podcast that slowed to almost nothing. Tour dates quietly disappearing from his website with no explanation. Then, in August of that year, his daughter posted something that finally gave the silence a name, a rare immune condition triggered by mold exposure while the family was clearing out a relative's house. A genetic vulnerability most people never even know they carry. She was careful to draw a line for his audience. This wasn't the same crisis as before. This wasn't medication. This was something new. At the time, that distinction felt important. In hindsight, it would prove almost impossible to hold onto, because within weeks, everything got worse. The same weakened immune system developed pneumonia. Pneumonia turned into sepsis, a bloodstream infection that can shut down organs one at a time if it isn't caught fast enough. It was caught, but barely. What followed was nearly a month in intensive care. Ventilators, monitors on every breath. A family kept largely outside a closed door, waiting for updates that didn't always bring good news. It was his daughter again who told the world what had happened, describing those months in 3 words: exceedingly difficult. For a stretch of that stay, the family genuinely believed they might lose him. He survived. But surviving sepsis at that level doesn't come free. Weeks of being sedated and immobile had caused nerve damage severe enough that a man who had walked across stages on every continent now had to relearn how to stand without support, how to hold a cup steady enough to drink from it. By October, he was out of intensive care but nowhere near home. He wouldn't actually walk through his own front door again until December, 4 months after a diagnosis that had briefly felt like an answer. And here's the part that made everything so much heavier. Surviving wasn't actually the hard part, because months later, in the spring of 2026, his daughter posted again, and this time, she reframed the entire story. The illness that had nearly killed him wasn't a new problem sitting on top of an old one. It was the same problem. The one from years earlier. It had never fully gone away. It had simply gone quiet until stress and illness woke it back up. Doctors have a name for cases like this that last this long. And by any normal measure, his case had already gone on for years past what's considered rare. There's very little precedent for a recovery this stretched out, which meant, for his family, very few answers about how much longer it might last. Then, in May 2026, his wife did something the family hadn't done before. She sat down for a full interview and described, in her own words, exactly what her husband was living through. He was at home, not chasing new treatments, not fighting for his life anymore, just home, with no timeline for anything beyond the day in front of him. She said he feels like he's in another realm of pain. She said his mornings are the hardest part, brutally painful, discouraging, and that only later in the day does he sometimes find a little relief. Think about that for a second. A man who spent 30 years telling people to get up and impose order on their day. First thing in the morning, and mornings had become the one part of the day he had to survive just to get through. She didn't stop at describing the pain. She used that same interview to make a bigger point that the damage traced back to psychiatric medication taken years earlier, and that the medical world needs to reckon with how many other people have quietly gone through the same thing without anyone believing them. And then came the detail that said more than any of it. Asked what he missed most, she didn't mention the tours. She didn't mention the fame. She said he misses being able to weigh in on the world, not the stage, just the conversation. A man who built an entire career on having something to say, and what he wanted back more than anything was simply the ability to say it. For almost a year, that's where the story sat. No timeline, no comeback, just silence from a man who used to never stop talking. Until one Sunday in June 2026, he posted again, not a new lecture, not a return to the podcast. Something smaller, a promise to release one old lecture a week from his archive, every single Sunday. For as long as the archive lasted, he said it let him do something useful while he was, in his own word, incapacitated. It wasn't the comeback anyone was hoping for, but maybe that was the point. A man who spent his career telling people to find the smallest meaningful task available to them when the bigger ones are out of reach was now living out that exact idea. In real time, with his own life. His legacy hasn't shrunk. 8 million subscribers, millions of books sold. None of that has gone anywhere. What's changed is what he can personally add to it right now. And in a strange way, that pause might end up teaching people something his books never fully could, because now an entire audience is watching, in real time, what it actually looks like to carry unbearable weight without any guarantee of how the story ends. If his words ever got you through a morning you didn't think you'd survive, that's worth sitting with for a second. What's the one idea of his that stayed with you the longest? And when his voice finally does come all the way back, will you still be here for it?